Final banter session of the evening, and it's great pleasure to welcome this gentleman. He's a New York Times journalist. He writes for the Metro section, but he's also the author of an amazing book called Hip to History. A couple of years ago at Banter in Dublin, we did a banter on the evolution of the hipster, and this book, Hip to History, was a tome we kind of like dipped into quite a lot in the night. So please give a welcome to John Leland. John is you're the very first, there's an awful lot of firsts here at Banter tonight. It's the first time we've done a banter in a church, but it's also the first time I've ever done a banter with someone who was dissed by Chuck D.
Threatened.
Yeah,
not only dissed, but threatened.
Let's before we get into the kind of CV, tell us about why Chuck D threatened you.
Well, there was a time when life was a lot simpler and there weren't too many people writing about hip-hop music. And I had written a review of Public Enemy's first album, Yo Bum Rush the Show. And I'd written a lot about the use of dissonance that the group used, and the editor had run the review under the title Noise a Noise, which we all know is a Buzzcocks song, but Chuck D didn't know that as a Buzzcocks song. So he was irate, torn up about this. So he went home and wrote the song Bring the Noise, which was about my review. And he came and he threatened me, I think, in the Melody Maker or the NME, said we went to F him up. And as I said, it was a simple time. There was not that kind of threatening behavior between hip-hop artists and journalists at that point. Mm-hmm. So I didn't really take it that seriously. It just seemed like a continuation of the rhetoric of hip-hop.
Yeah.
He was a suburban collegiate guy. I was a suburban collegiate guy. We liked sports. We were just like, playing big willies with one another. So we developed a kind of a nice relationship out of that.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I mean there was an infamous interview you did with Chuck D for Spin magazine then, and I went back and read the interview during the week, and you can still, there's a crackle in that interview, John. There's a tension that was in the interview.
That was the next step. I think that having done that and having stood up to him in the interview and not back down, and because there wasn't any reason not to back down. So it seemed all rhetorical to me, and we were just going to kind of go at it, and it was. I think it was respectful, but tough, and people have read it afterwards and thought, I was really bold standing up to him, but I never really saw it that way.
Yeah. Okay, I suppose we've jumped ahead a couple of years. We met yesterday. We talked yesterday at a student workshop in the Verbal Arts Centre around the corner. And we're kind of talking to would-be student journalists about like why they should kind of run for the hills, why they should actually do journalism. And it was really interesting. You were kind of talking then about how you got into it. Maybe kind of like you could recap about the first times you were writing for like Spin and the Village Voice and Details magazine.
Well, I was just a guy who liked music, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I was sort of driven to it by that. You could get free records if you wrote about records. You could get into clubs for free, and so it seemed like a fun thing to do. Life was simpler then. It was also a lot cheaper then, so you could get out there and write $30 record reviews and sort of pay your rent and feed yourself after a fashion. Yeah.
Okay. So that writing took you from the Village Voice to Spin magazine, and at what stage then did you kind of decide to cash in your chips and kind of go for the establishment and go for the New York Times?
I think it was as I was getting a little bit older. I went to the first place I worked was a newspaper called New York Newsday, and I thought that I was getting a little bit older. My interests in music were a little bit different. I like the idea that music should be discussed in the context of the rest of life. And you had to do that in a mainstream newspaper as opposed to in a music magazine where the Red Hot Chili Peppers might have meant the world to you, but they weren't the entire world. They weren't the most important thing in the world. So you could still discuss the Red Hot Chili Peppers, but in the context of everything else that was going on.
Right. So, over your time in at the New York Times, you explained yesterday you've kind of written for various desks. You were in Iraq. You've wandered around America as well, and you're currently at the Metro desk. Is that right?
I love it. Yes.
Yeah. So, what do you cover at the Metro desk at the moment?
I cover the 5 boroughs. I'm a feature writer, so I write long Sunday features that take. I don't even want to say publicly how long they take to do, but they take a while.
Yeah, and like you kind of said this, like that it's a bit of a luxury as well, the fact you've got that you've been allocated that kind of time and I suppose patience to develop these stories.
It's not just a luxury, I think it's becoming an anachronism. People don't get the time. People do 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 stories a week, and I just don't do that. I'm fortunate I can do it. When I was in Iraq I did it, but it's not what I would like to do. I like to get time to really get into stories and just learn more.
Yeah. Do you find? I mean, do you find then, like, you know, as someone who's lucky enough to kind of like be allowed devote so much time to stories, you know, and you obviously know from everyone else what that they kind of the state journalism in right now, be it the low pay, be it the casualization, be it the fact that you've just kind of said 5-6 stories, maybe 5-6 stories a day in some cases, like, you know, that in many ways, you know, that. These are the end of times, you know, that someone can, in 10 years' time, do you expect to be in that kind of situation that, or that New York Times will allow someone that kind of time to spend on those stories?
I hope so. I mean, I think it's something that is a reason to come to the New York Times. If you want to find out who won the ball game, you don't need to go to the New York Times anymore for that. If you want to find out the stock prices, you don't need to go to the New York Times for that. But if you want a certain level of reporting that takes into account like resources around the globe, there are getting to be fewer and fewer places to go to for that. So I think it you know, as everybody else gives it up and can't afford to do it, it becomes more valuable to the people that can.
Right. Let's turn to kind of like, I mean, the longer form writing in the books in particular. I mean, I know you wrote a book on Jack Kerouac, but like maybe kind of like we talk a little bit now about kind of hip the history, and tell us a little bit about why you were attracted to that particular subject.
Because it's what we grow up with. Are we attracted to it? We're obsessed with it. We're infected by it. Why is it that kids are killing each other over a certain pair of sneakers and not over another pair of sneakers that are just as good? You know, why is it that people will follow Lou Reed down the road to perdition, or you know, like make Moby Dick the guidepost to their life? So, you know, I got really kind of fascinated by that question. Why did Bugs Bunny raise us as much as our parents did? You know, what do all these things have in common?
Yeah. Okay, so like, I mean, the book is fascinating. It's so detailed, and it's really intense and dense in a really good way, because I mean, you really go at the subject in a interesting fashion. I mean, you kind of like, I mean, trace the history of hip back to, you know, immigrants from Europe and Africa to America.
Right.
And like, I mean, you know, and even the word hip as well, where that kind of came from. You know, like I suppose, talk us a little bit about the kind of your workflow plan for the book. I mean, had you kind of like it planned out? Did you know where you're going to go with this?
I should say, if you ever want to do like something that's incredibly unhip, write a book about hip, because it means just sort of burying yourself in a cave for a couple of years, which is essentially what I did. But you know, as I started to get into this, and I asked myself, you know, why is it we care about these things? What is it? I've always thought that pop culture was important, but I never really asked myself why. You know, what was it that mattered? And one of the first things I did was think about the word hip. We understand why the word cool means cool, right? It just means cool, that's what it is. But why does hip mean hip? I don't know why it does. So I started to do some research in that. There were a lot of explanations. One was that opium smokers would have a burn on their hip or a bruise on their hip from lying on their hip. Another was that during Prohibition, if you were carrying a pint, you were hipped. Or another was that you had hip boots on, so as the water is raging around you, you're dry. But the best explanation I found was that it became from these West African words, hippie or heppy, meaning to see or to open your eyes. And that told me a couple things. One is that hip wasn't like so much fashion so much as a kind of enlightenment. Hip me to that. He's hip to what's going on. And the other is that it came from West Africa. So what does that mean? It's not a European thing. It's not like indigenous to who we are. And that it spread to the general population, the white population. So it means that in a divided culture that was as divided as you could possibly be, there was this interplay. How does the word pass back and forth? Why do we know what you're doing and you know what we're doing? And that was what hip is. And you look at American culture, and that's kind of the centerpiece of it. It'll take you from, you know, Mark Twain to Miles Davis, and you say, okay, yeah, that's really, it's going back and forth. Not always benevolently, but yes.
Exactly, because I mean, it's also kind of very much tied up in terms of, like, you mean, American race as well, American race issues. Did you find, as you were kind of like investigating the book and researching the book, that became more clear, that, like, I mean, this whole idea of hip became almost like a secret language among like, I mean, African Americans to keep things away from the white man? Yes,
and it was not entirely successful, right? That's the great thing about it, is that we are able to spy on each other. We're able to form allegiances with each other. And in this culture that is, again, officially divided, and at its like most passionate elements is divided, when we tell stories about ourselves, who we are, those stories are very integrated. You look at our literature, our cartoons, our music, they're much more black and white than our residential situation, our dining, our churches.
Yeah, like, and the other thing about it as well is that there was an evolution of hip down through the years as well, because you talked there about like the fact that it became a way of kind of like a secret, a kind of a way that people would communicate with each other, an observational way as well. But like, I mean, there was different kind of, I suppose, you highlight in the book six different ages of hip, starting with kind of like, there was a jazz age, bohemians and all that. Did you kind of find that like there's a great, I suppose, kind of interplay between all these and a great kind of overlay between them as well?
Yeah, you found that certain patterns would start to work this way out. Often a new technology, such as radio, such as records, such as film and the digital world now, would lead to new language among people, new shared points of reference that the people on the outside didn't get, and just kind of new secrets that people were telling, new kinds of stories that people were telling. And so those would create, a sort of groundswell. Usually economic recession or changes in the economy, suddenly going from a good economy to a bad economy, or a bad economy to a good economy. You think of the 1950s, the Beat Generation, the beboppers, you're just in that early part of the post-war economic expansion, but you're not in the full flush of it yet. So people can afford, hip is something of a luxury.
Hip is definitely something of luxury, but now it's a commodity now. There's a certain value to it, I mean, like now when we think about hip and hipsters, we think about Williamsburg or Silver Lake or like, I mean, Shoreditch or even Derry, We think of these kind of like these centres, and also we think of hip as a way of selling things. It definitely has a way of kind of adding value. Do you think that was always there? Did hip always have a commercial cachet all the way through the ages?
It's so funny. I started writing this book around 2002. And back then, there were no symposiums on what should we do about the hipster. What is this plague upon the land, and can we get people to shave and wear like looser jeans? But yeah, it was kind of always there. Like Malcolm Cowley talked about this and said well, hipsters, people moving around. That's the reason you have to buy 2 stoves, because you moved to a new apartment. There was always that commercialization. People in the 1910s or the 1920s would go to the village to see these people that wore like the black leotards and lived in the $3 flats. So that kind of was always there, and I think that's kind of an important part about what it is. It has to attract other people. Otherwise, it's just what you and I are talking about. We could be the coolest guys in the world, but if the people out there don't think we're cool, then we're not that cool.
Right, okay.
But we are.
We are actually we're ultra cool. We're super cool, We're the coolest people in Derry tonight, and not just because it's slightly cold in this church as well. I've just realised that as well. But like that idea, John, that idea that like of using hip as a kind of like as a kind of commercial value, it just strikes me that in recent times that it just has become a lot more prevalent. Maybe it is the rise of the ubiquitous hipster, but like it just strikes me that like, I mean, hip has suddenly become this way of flogging things, which often aren't quite hip. You get corporations moving into this kind of area. You get them trying to kind of like attach hip to kind of various things they're trying to sell. And it just strikes me that in many ways it's the most unhip thing going.
Every company is a rebel company now.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're rebelling against exactly, but everybody's an outsider. Nobody wants to claim to be an insider anymore.
Yeah.
Of course, no one will claim to be a hipster either, but everybody's in that mold. Athletes used to be the squarest people in the world. Joe America, Joe Athlete. They're not anymore. They're hip-hop gangsters. And your teachers used to be square, but they're not square anymore. They talk the talk. Your evangelical ministers all have the little goatees, and the skinny jeans. So no one wants to be that other person anymore.
Yeah. Have you followed the kind of like the rise of twee in recent times? I mean, do you think the two are very much intertwined?
Didn't you think twee had a little the short shelf life and it's still around? Like, I don't get it.
Yeah, it's really funny. There's a book by Mark Spitz on Tweety that's just been published, and it just strikes me that he seems to spend the whole book. I mean, just a total aside. He seems to spend the whole book trying to avoid the word hipster all the way through it. You know, it seems the two are very much linked.
Well, you know, it's as if I'm so glad we're not listening to shoegazer bands anymore.
Yeah.
Or there's not like a next generation of shoegazer bands.
In terms of kind of like, I mean, the hip interplay with kind of popular culture, it struck me from the book as well that, like, you know, you seem to kind of like, I mean, really put a lot of value by that punk rock period in the in the 70s as well. You know, do you think was that because, I mean, of your own kind of personal involvement? Then that was your age of growing up, or is there something bigger involved?
I'd like to think there's something bigger involved, but it certainly has a lot to do with my age. I came to New York in 1977. Punk rock and hip hop were going on. You know, I wanted to be part of both of those things. You remembered like seeing, you know, I told the story the other day, so forgive me, but you know, I lived near a handball court when I came to New York. Handball courts had graffiti artists attached to them. Graffiti artists had DJs and rappers and b-boys attached to them. So I first experienced this music kind of live on the street by my apartment. And you just thought this was the most exciting thing you could possibly imagine. I'm too young for the Beatles, I'm too young for Chuck Berry and Little Richard. But you saw this stuff and you thought, my God, this is it. You know, this is what everybody was talking about when they talked about the Beatles and Little Richard and Woodstock.
Right. The book was published a few years ago. Have you been approached about like upgrading it or like updating it?
Oh, that's the last thing I want to do. It's a history book, and history has to stop someplace. But you know, one of the things that people do approach me about sometimes, and I've tried to avoid, is being mismanners. And people will say, "Well, what's hip now? Tell us what's hip." And I don't want to tell people that you know the thing you're doing is cool or not cool. That's kind of the last thing I wanted to do. I wanted to look at that historical period and see where it comes from as an idea. Yeah. And if it's that idea about knowledge and enlightenment and all, we can kind of see where that's going.
Totally, because I mean that strikes me. One of the problems with kind of the hipsters today and that whole hip notion is that it's almost as if there's most publications. I don't know if it's the case in the New York Times. Most publications have a what's not and what's hot and what's not list. You know, and it just strikes me as like, you know, it's almost like a form of kind of preordained hipness. You know, these are the tablets. You basically like accept one or the other. Whereas I mean, from the reading of the book and from kind of like, I mean, my understanding of hip is that, like, you know, someone who may well be regarded as quite eccentric or regarded as kind of like being totally really an outsider, really a maverick. I mean, they're far more hip because I mean they've got that cultural understanding, they've got like a bearing about them that hasn't been bought or hasn't been purchased by a brand.
Right, and one of the flaws with the in-out list or hip and unhip list is it's the last thing you should aspire to. That should be this verdict that other people, you know, give you after the fact. Right. But it really should not be your goal.
Right. After like hip history, have you written any other books, or have you any plans at the moment to write books?
I wrote a book about Jack Kerouac's On the Road a couple of years ago called Why Kerouac Matters, The Lessons of On the Road, that just really involves spending a year and a half or so reading On the Road and writing about what the text was of On the Road had to say, not the ways we've read it over the years. And we've kind of imposed these readings upon the book that says, you know, great joyful burst into the unknown. And you find if you read the book doesn't support that.
Right. Just refresh my memory, because I mean I'm remembering Jack Kerouac's On the Road as kind of like a beat odyssey that kind of like was part hipster, kind of like chronicle, and part kind of Huckleberry Finn. I mean, what did your reading and rereading of the books show you?
Well, I think odyssey is a good word. You know, they're on a spiritual quest. You know, Kerouac talks about, you know, there's two times in the book where they find God. So that's a big part of it. It's Kerouac's Catholicism. It's one of the big driving forces in the book. And the other thing is, he tells you from the first line, it's about this thing that starts with the death of his father. And they go out looking for Neil Cassidy's father, the Dean Moriarty character, who's a hobo in Denver, and he's a homeless guy. So they go to search for Dean's father, and that's a big part of their journey. Where does the book end? The book ends with Kerouac meeting his second wife, and beginning what's going to be settling down with her. So it's not this journey into the unknown. It's this guy who's fatherless, feeling fatherless because his father has just died. He's uprooted, and what he's looking for is this kind of domestic comfort that is going to elude Kerouac for all of his life.
Right. That's a kind of a fascinating take, because most people buy into kind of a totally different shorthand in the book. Are there any other books you would kind of like to do that on, like a rereading of, an exact reading of?
Yeah, I had this idea. I thought I would do that with Moby Dick. After this, I thought that would be the fun book to wander through. And then I looked at the Moby Dick scholarship, and the Moby Dick scholarship was so great. One of the great things about the beats, and one of the reasons you can write about them, is the scholarship tends to be a little thin and quick.
Yeah.
They're so cool, and this is why they're cool.
Yeah. Do you miss writing about music? I mean, this is kind of like as a music journalist myself, and I was listening to you yesterday talking about this, and I was kind of, do you miss it? Do you miss it in any way? Because it was such a part of your life for so long.
You know when I miss it? I'll write about music a couple times a year, and when I'm doing it, I think, God, I love doing this. And then it's over, and I'm happy that it's over.
Yeah.
What I always liked was meeting the people, figuring out what this thing that meant so much to them, why it means so much to them. And you can do that with everything.
Right. What comes next for you? I mean, do you plan to write other books at the moment?
I don't have another book that I have planned right now. I have like everybody else, I've got an unpublished novel in the drawer that every so often I dream about spiffing up a little bit.
Right. Okay. And have you, this has been your first time to Northern Ireland, hasn't it?
It is.
Have you enjoyed it?
I'm loving it. I'm loving it. The spirit of the people here is fantastic. There's you can see that you can see the scars here, and then you can see the desire to get beyond them.
Cool. John Leland, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's perfect.
Thanks, Jim.
That's great. Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks.
You had a good time.
It's great.
Great.
Thank you.